In this video, we're going to get started with the Windows platform, the Universal Windows Platform, also known as UWP. And this is a computing platform created by Microsoft, first introduced when Windows 10 was released. And really, the purpose of this platform is to be able to develop what are called universal apps. So, universal apps can run in a variety of different environments, right? Whether that's Windows, like Windows 10 or Windows 11, it can run on Xbox, it can run on HoloLens, and then with some extensions, can also run in other environments like iOS or Android, Linux, Unix, Mac OS, all these different environments. So there are lots of new things to learn when it comes to developing for the Universal Windows platform. And you can see here, like on the main Microsoft website, they talk about like adaptive controls. So, kind of leaning on some of these ideas that maybe you've learned if you've done some web development, where we can build controls and layouts that then expand or contract to the environment that they're being used in. And then you can put them in the store and you can do all kinds of cool stuff with them. So, we're going to get started with how to build these kinds of applications. And to make sure that you have everything that you need, I mean, not only will you need to have like Windows 10 or Windows 11, you'll also need Visual Studio 22 or higher. And then that walks you through, there's some tools that you can install. Uh, you know, if you're C Sharp developer, which is what we're going to be doing. If you don't have Visual Studio installed, getting that, making sure you have the required workloads and components, because otherwise you will not see the project templates that we need. And so making sure that you have all the right things installed in your Visual Studio workload application section will make sure that you are ready to get started. So if you have all of these things, then you can jump right into Visual Studio and start to create a new project. And I like to use these filters because there's way too many templates involved. You should be finding the UWP, and we can get started with a blank app, and then it should say Universal Windows, and then we're in C Sharp, and so it'll say some other things down here. Just make sure you've got the right type of template that you want to use. And so you could just leave this app one if you needed to, or we could call this intro app or something like that. And then it will create, we do have to select a target version of Windows in this case. If you have Windows 11, you can target Windows 11. Otherwise, it's going to pull your current target and minimum builds. So in most cases, you can leave those alone unless there's something specific that you're looking for. And then once that is done, Visual Studio will pop us right into our platform. So let's take a look at the Solution Explorer so that we can get an idea of the kinds of files that are involved. So these universal apps, they run on a language format called XAML. That's XAML. And these files, as we look at them, you'll notice they look a lot like maybe HTML or XML, which is really where this comes from. This extensible application markup language is the language that's been designed to define the app's user interface. So if maybe you're used to building Windows forms and you've been developing for a while, this might come as a shock that we no longer have a visual kind of drag and drop controls editor, and we have to build everything in our XAML files for our user interface, and then we can preview it when we demo our app, when we actually run it. So let's take a look at some of the files in the Solution Explorer. So it starts with, we have this app.xaml. So if we take a look at our app file, and here you can see what this looks like. This is where we can declare any resources that are used across the app. And then you'll notice there's a drop-down arrow because there's actually a C# file, what we call code behind, that goes with this. So we have app.xaml and app.xaml.cs. And so we can see that there's some C# in here. And inside of this, kind of like all code behind pages, right? If you're not familiar with this, contains a constructor that calls initialize component. This is all generated by Visual Studio. Its main purpose is to initialize the elements that we might declare in our XAML file. This is the entry point for our application. So As you look at that CS file, you're going to see, hey, on launched is things that happen when the application is launched. If particular activities happen, like on navigation failed, on suspending. So as you get a little more proficient in your universal applications, you might be coming in here to add to some of these features or modify some of these as necessary. We also see a package.app xmanifest. And so a manifest is generally a configuration file that describes your app. So we get information about its name, its description, its tile, its start page. We can have dependencies, resources, lists of files that our app contains. And then if we were going to submit this to the store, there's some additional information we would want to make sure is set up in here so that we can actually pass through the checks on the store and that information would be available to the user. So let's take a look at how we actually modify some of the files in our application. We can see that it came with this main page XAML. And so this editor, here we go, here is our sample, and then here is where we can edit. Now you can pull this window around if you need a little more space. You can actually pull this all the way up if you don't want the preview at all and you need a little more space. And then of course, Visual Studio will let you undock this pane entirely if you have a wider monitor and you want maybe your code on one side and your preview on the other or something like that. Or if you have two monitors, you can actually separate these windows out and do that this way. And then of course there is the code behind file, the main page XAML CS, where you would put any of your C# code. Now we do have a bit of this like drag and drop editor in that if you unlock this toolbar, you can see in here some common XAML controls, all XAML controls, kind of reminiscent of what we used to do in the old days of Windows Forms. But let's just take a look at what happens if we want to grab a button and then we can plop it down on our page here. And so you can see that it updates. I get some controls, like if I want to make it real big or something like that. And then we can see that the XAML down here updated, added a grid element, put our button inside. We can see if I wanted to name this like Click Me, I could change that in the XAML. It changes in my overview, gives me some margin properties, some alignment, height, width, things like that. And so this is kind of how the layout works. We can drag and drop things from the toolbar. We can then modify properties here in the XAML and then get things to work the way that we want them to work. So let's go ahead and create what's called an event handler. And an event handler maybe sounds complicated, but it's really just the name for code that's called when an event happens. And the event that we want to have happen is clicking on our button. So you can do this a couple of different ways, but usually you can just double click. You see me double click on the button on the form there, and then it generated and threw me right into the main page XAML CS and created this button click event for me. So this button click event is what's going to happen when someone clicks on this button when our application is running. So let's change this to where we actually have something happen when our button is clicked. All right, so I've added a little code to our button click. As you can see from the comment here, I've created what's called a message dialog, which is like a little pop-up box. New message dialog. In here, I want it to say hello world. And then I just call the show async when I want that message box to show. So let's take a look at what this looks like, and we will have completed our first app. So if I run on the local machine, it should boot that right up. And oh, it's loaded it in another window. There we go. And so here's our button. We can see where it's placed on the page, and this is basically what it looked like in the preview. And if I click it, I get my hello world box. It just comes with a close button. That's just the simple message box without any frills. And I can close it. And I can do this over and over as many times as I want. Every time I'm clicking that button, which is on our page right here, we can see that the click event of the button is assigned to a method named button click. And that event is right here. So congratulations on completing your first app using our universal app development for Windows. We're going to have several more videos that kind of dig into this so that you can start to understand how to use lots of different controls. But I hope you've enjoyed, and you're welcome to start playing around with this sample app.